Last video, we did all of the necessary footwork in order to have a proper, calm, informed, and not at all incendiary or divisive conversation about whether Joel is a moral monster for saving Ellie at the end of The Last of Us. If you missed that video, there should be a link somewhere in the top right corner of your screen in order to catch yourself up. And just a disclaimer, this video has spoilers for both The Last of Us and The Last of Us Part 2 moving forward. But if you're okay with that, and you're all caught up from the first video, grab your fork and a pen as we go in for seconds on this slice of pie. Is Joel a good or a bad person for saving Ellie at the end of The Last of Us? Using each of our normative theories, by the end of this video, we will definitively, definitely, indisputably, unequivocally have an answer to that question. Let's start with deontology. Just a disclaimer before we get into the weeds of this section, deontology is bonkers complicated. There's a few different strains of deontology, but for this video, we're just going to focus on Kant's. And just a disclaimer about Kant's deontology, it's bonkers complicated. So here's my best attempt at simplifying it while also analyzing Joel's decision to save Ellie. Deontology is an ethical theory that places right action on the performance of duties. Kant's theory has two main ingredients. First, you have a maxim, which is just a phrase that expresses that you'll perform an action in a particular circumstance to bring about a particular goal. They take the form of sentences like, I'll eat this ice cream when it's hot outside in order to cool off. We use these maxims in order to analyze the second ingredient, the categorical imperative. It's a command that can be applied universally and what, for Kant, directs moral action. Kant explains his categorical imperative through 4 different formulations, but for the sake of time and simplicity, I'm only going to focus on the first 2 here. If people are interested, I can make another video looking at the other 2 formulations, but for now, let's just start with the formula of the universal law of nature. So, what's that? In Kant's words, this tells you to act only in accordance with that maxim through which you can at the same time will that it become a universal law. Basically, all this means is that you take a maxim, those I'll do something in some circumstance for some end phrases, then you assume every other rational being will also adopt your maxim. And finally, you ask yourself whether or not it's even feasible that every rational being in the world adopts that particular maxim. If you can reasonably universalize your maxim and will that everyone else also adopt and act on it, then you're good to go and you're doing the morally right thing. If you can't, then you're not. Try again. So, what would Joel's maxim look like when faced with the decision to save Ellie or let her die for a vaccine? Probably something like this. I'll save those that I love when they're in danger so that they can live. Yeah, okay, pretty reasonable, Joel. So, one cool thing about the world of The Last of Us is that it gives you examples of people reasoning through categorical imperatives in real time. Surrounding the same situation of killing Ellie to make a cure, Jerry is having to decide whether or not he should kill a girl when she could produce the cure in order to save humanity. And while he's struggling with that decision, Abby comes in and says, look, Dad, universalize that maxim.
You're doing the right thing.
Yeah.
If it was me, I'd want you to do the surgery.
You can universalize that maxim all day long. You could easily will that anyone does whatever it takes to save humanity. Does Joel have that same luxury? Would people readily will Joel's maxim for Jerry too, or for any other parent? Is that rational? Could we reasonably will that universally? It seems no, especially given the particular circumstances that we're provided with. We can't rationally say that every individual ever should forgo the chance at a cure for a pandemic that's all but wiped out humanity just to save one individual that they love. We're a part of humanity, so we can't rationally will that someone else sacrifice that same humanity that we're a part of for their own desire to preserve one other person's life. Can we understand why they might want to do that? Yeah, sure. But rationally willing that they do it is a whole other requirement to meet, and Kant has arguments about how rationally willing your own demise, however indirect, is internally inconsistent with itself, and is therefore irrational. So for the first formulation of the categorical imperative, it's not looking good for Joel. Kind of a jerk move, dude. What about the second formulation? The formula of humanity. This is basically the golden rule of deontology. Kant says every rational being exists as an end in itself, not merely as a means to be used by this or that will at its discretion. Basically, there are things in this world whose worth is dependent on whether or not they're able to provide for us effectively. These are objects like money, cars, houses, YouTube, etc. We treat these things as means toward our own ends. Money to buy the things that we want, cars to get us where we want to go, YouTube to provide us entertainment. But there's another category of things in this world whose worth is not in relation to our own wills and desires, but are worthwhile on account of their own nature. These are rational beings, or what Kant calls persons. Now, super important to recognize that this formulation doesn't say that we can't ever use people as a means to things. That would mean that we could never use people at Starbucks to make our iced double mocha frappuccinos for us. What this formulation tells us is that there's something to be recognized and respected over and above their mere providing us a service. Their humanity. If we stop recognizing their humanity, then we're doing something morally wrong. So, in an interesting twist, given that the Fireflies were planning on basically sacrificing Ellie for the sake of a cure, they're in pretty obvious violation of this formulation of the categorical imperative. No matter how much the second game shows us that they struggled with their decision, it's made pretty clear that they never asked Ellie how she felt about it, and they jumped right into testing and eventually being willing to kill her for their own goals and their own desires. Not cool, Fireflies. Not cool. But that means that Joel, being on the opposite end of this particular moral disagreement, has to be right. Right? Well, no. See, no matter how we try to justify Joel's actions, he also didn't acknowledge or recognize the humanity or rationality in Ellie when he made a decision for her. He made a decision for his own desires to save a second daughter, presumably towards his own end of being able to continue living with and avoiding the guilt of losing a person he loved without ever considering Ellie's own ends. He does get some points for respecting Ellie's life insofar as a life is necessary for the ends that Kant is saying we should respect in other people, but an important part of someone's humanity is being able to make their own decisions and act accordingly. So, where the Fireflies didn't give Ellie a choice in the matter, neither did Joel. And by denying Ellie the opportunity to make a fully informed, rational decision on her own behalf, Joel wasn't respecting the humanity in Ellie, which is kind of a core requirement for the formulation of humanity. Important to note that there's questions of consent for minors here. Ellie was 14. And so even if they asked, there might be some debates about whether or not she was able to make a fully informed and rational decision to end her own life. But the Fireflies were going to kill her dead, so she'd never have that choice anyway. So, bad Fireflies. And Joel killed all of the Fireflies and apparently, according to the second game, the only doctor that would be able to make a cure. So even though she would eventually be old enough to make that decision for herself, that decision isn't available anymore because Joel killed everyone. So, bad Joel. Even if Joel's heart was in the right place then, and even if his actions were immediately justifiable, the way he went about it still robbed Ellie of being able to make her own rational choice eventually, and so, according to Kant, was morally bad. Joel strikes out again. But wait, we still have more theories to look at, so maybe it's still somehow okay. Let's try hedonism. Hedonism, especially compared to deontology, is actually a pretty straightforward moral theory. The morally good thing is the thing that creates the most amount of pleasure for you. So if Joel's actions contributed a significant amount of pleasure for him, then he'll be looking good.
Don't you fucking touch me!
God!
Oh. Joel, yeah, let's try consequentialism. Consequentialism, in theory, is pretty straightforward, because what it cares about is right there in the name. For the consequentialists, the morality of an action is just determined by consequences of an action. If the consequences of a particular action are good, well, then the action was good. And if the consequences of a particular action are bad, well, then the action was bad. The tricky part is coming up with how we determine what's actually good and what's actually bad. And there's a couple different theories for that too. One in particular, the most popular, is utilitarianism, and it takes a note from consequentialism insofar as what it cares about is right there in the name. Utilitarianism? Utility. You get it. And here, by the way, utility has nothing to do with knives or closets or belts. Although, any action that gives me more Batman bat belts is probably a good action. Anyway. What utility does have to do with is just happiness. Whatever action produces the most amount of happiness for the most amount of people is the most moral action. And the goodness of the action declines as the measurement for happiness does. So let's roll the clip and see if Joel maximizes happiness for everyone. Nope. But wait, Joel might still have a case according to the utilitarian. You see, if we just analyze a single action and the consequences of that single action, we're operating under what's called act utilitarianism. Act utilitarianism is pretty much exactly what it sounds like. Just like consequentialism and utilitarianism, now that I think about it. Anyway, they look at each individual action, and the right action is the one that produces the most amount of happiness. Clearly not the case in Joel's decision. Luckily for Joel, though, we have rule utilitarianism. He has a bit more of a case according to this theory. Rule utilitarianism gives us the opportunity to abstract out a bit so that we can be more nuanced in our decision making. Instead of looking at an act, it looks at a rule. Who saw that coming? And their procedure operates like this. An action is morally right if it conforms with a justified rule, and a rule is justified in its inclusion in our moral code if it will create the most amount of utility. So, as long as the rule generally results in actions that produce the most happiness, we're golden. So, what possible rule could Joel have adopted in order to make his action justifiable? What about, like, I don't know, save loved ones. Most of the time, if you're acting on a rule to save your loved ones, you're not really going to be leaving a wake of pain and misery. Quite the opposite, in fact. You'll be making them happy, you happy, and anyone else who loves them happy as well. Now, you'll be making the people putting them in danger sad, but they're bad people, and they're breaking our rule, so really who cares about them? The issues with rule utilitarianism come in when we have rules that conflict with one another. So, in addition to Joel's rule, save your loved ones, it seems like he's also adopted a rule, do what you can to save humanity. Because, after all, he did travel across the country in order to take Ellie to the Fireflies. And those two rules, unfortunately, in this particular instance, conflict. And Joel has to decide which one to give precedent. If you can save one person, or you can save multiple people, up to and including the entirety of the human race in this instance, it's not even a complicated calculus to realize that for the utilitarian, the rule prioritizing all of humanity wins out against the rule prioritizing just one person. So it seems like Joel picked the wrong rule to give priority. In this instance, though, we don't have the luxury of knowing the full extent of the consequences of Joel's action. At one point, I swear I saw an interview with Neil Druckmann claiming the cure would have definitely worked if Joel allowed Ellie to die. But I can't for the life of me find that interview anymore, so I'm not going to assume that's the case. Instead, we're going to have to speculate about what could have happened if Joel let Ellie die. The first possibility is that there could have been a cure, and we could have been faced with all of the consequences that come with that. People have argued that it would have caused more strife for the living humans as they fight over the vaccine. There's concern over the power dynamic of the one group who has the vaccine and how they choose to distribute it. Just look at how the military treated people in the quarantine zones when they were the only ones who could reliably provide food. It could cause more focused wars and disputes as people try to steal the vaccines or prevent it from being distributed to other certain groups because, let's be honest, people are kind of bastards. Or potentially it would be handled well and life would be able to continue without concern for the cordyceps virus. Our second possibility is that it might not have worked at all and Ellie would have died for no reason and Joel and the Fireflies would have to deal with that and the world would continue to go on like none of the events of the first game ever happened. So, as you can see, analyzing the possible causes and effects of a single big decision is a bit much, and it's one of the downsides of consequentialism. It's a lot of work, so I'm just going to leave those possibilities on the table and throw it to you to talk about what you think. What do you think the most likely outcome would be if Joel let Ellie die? Let me know in the comments, and tell me whether you think that means Joel is a good or a bad person as a result. In the interest of not making this video an hour long though, and given that I'm not Doctor Strange, I'm gonna go ahead and move on to our next theory. Virtue theory. Alright, so virtue theory shifts the focus of our other normative theories just a bit. Instead of focusing on external considerations like imperatives and consequences, the virtue theorist redirects their attentions inside, focusing instead on the character of an individual. And they're not really doing anything fancy with our common conceptions of virtue either. A virtue is just a kind of excellence that we typically want to praise in another person. Aristotle characterized it as a disposition, a trait that someone's prone to in any particular circumstance. For example, a person who has the virtue honesty just tends to be honest. Whenever there's a situation that calls for honesty, they don't really have to struggle against themselves or their environment to be honest. They just kind of are. And this is where virtue theory gets in the weeds just a little bit. A consequence of this conception of ethics is that we can't look at any individual action. Dishonest people can be honest occasionally, but those occasions aren't enough to call a person honest and praise them for it. If someone we don't know tells the truth once, that's not really enough information to determine whether or not they're an honest person. We can't reach inside and pull out their character and give it a once-over for flaws. And this is why Aristotle said that virtue is only really observable through a whole human life. We can begin to get a better picture about whether or not someone has habituated themselves toward a particular character if we can observe the entirety of their life. And again, thanks to the magic of video games, we have that luxury for Joel. The problem is, Joel's life is just a little bit spotty. Roll the clip.
How did you know?
Know what?
About the ambush.
I've been on both sides.
Oh. So, we kill a lot of innocent people? I'll take that as a yes.
Take it however you want.
Okay. But just because Joel has been inconsistent, that doesn't necessarily mean we can't still praise him for saving Ellie on account of virtue. See, virtue is hard. Like, really, really, really hard. It's not just a character disposition developed through habituation over an entire life. It's an entire way of reasoning to a particular action in any given circumstance that changes from person to person, from circumstance to circumstance, and from time to time. For Aristotle, it's doing the right thing, at the right time, in the right way, by the right person, and according to the right situation. And that means that a virtuous person has to be able to quickly and reliably reason through all of these considerations any time that they act. You can see why it takes a lifetime to develop. If you're not an honest person, you're going to hesitate when you're trying to figure out the right thing to do in some situations. Whereas the honest person has had practice at being honest, and they're just going to know pretty easily how to perform honesty in most situations. It's why Aristotle and Julia Annis also characterize virtue as a skill. I have a whole paper on that, but I won't bore you with the details here. Basically, it takes practice and you learn it through doing and habituation. And because it's about learning over a whole life, it's extremely rare for someone to be a completely virtuous saint. The good news for Joel is that the first game is all about his arc from cold and callous, survive-at-any-cost smuggler to loving father. His whole story is about losing his humanity because of the loss of his daughter, and then finding it again in his journey with Ellie. If virtue is about development, Joel's got development. And even though it might be the case that he's not exactly a virtuous saint by the end of his life, remember, very few people are, we can at least see that he was working on making himself better, acting out of love and concern for other people, even saving complete strangers' lives at the risk of his own at the start of the second game. So, how do we determine whether or not Joel made the right choice by saving Ellie, killing all the Fireflies, and denying the world of a potential cure to a deadly virus? Maybe unsurprisingly, it's kind of hard. It depends on how we think about Joel's particular reasoning through his actions. If we think that Joel reasoned well in his decision, prioritizing the right things, and that he understood the full weight of his decision, well, then we can say he acted well and should probably be praised for saving Ellie. One way to look at the situation, unfortunately for Joel, is that it was really rash. There were about 100 different ways that he could have handled the situation. Just off the top of my head, he could have at least suggested that they wake Ellie up prior to performing the surgery in order to inform her of all the consequences. And yeah, again, the Fireflies are certainly not without fault here. They didn't give Joel much of a chance to talk. But there's a lot of steps between even trying to suggest to Marlene that they wake Ellie up, which Joel didn't, to killing about 100 people, including a doctor who was pretty much defenseless, to take Ellie away and close that option off from Ellie and humanity forever. I mean, it seems like once Joel got to the operating room, he could have just told the doctor, "Hey man, we're going to put this on hold just for a bit to see what Ellie has to say about it." He's killed so many people up to that point, I doubt anyone would argue with him. But even if more Fireflies did show up and try to kill him as a result, that's a consequence of his rashness again, killing about 100 people to get what he wanted. It doesn't seem very well reasoned, thought out, or calculated at all on Joel's part. And again, this doesn't mean that the Fireflies were in the right, just that Joel's not off the hook. It's totally possible that multiple people are assholes all at once. But even this kind of a theory focused on the character of an individual is missing something important for some theorists. While it might address concerns about internal versus external considerations, it still focuses largely on cold, emotionless obligations, ignoring something kind of essential to good human beings: our emotions. And that's where we get our fifth theory, care ethics. Care ethics largely is an offshoot of virtue ethics. It has a lot of the same characteristics, but it tries to add something that's been ignored in all of our normative theories up to this point. Instead of focusing strictly on some sort of abstract ideal, a rule or contract, or the consequences of actions, care ethics emphasizes that the world we find ourselves in is saturated with relationships. For care ethics, ethical participation in this world, then, raises the importance of these relationships in our considerations for action, instead of emphasizing our own adherence to moral law or our own development of moral characteristics. This is a relatively new theory in normative moral thinking and was pioneered by Carol Gilligan and Nell Noddings in the 1980s. The major flaw in moral theory and in theories of moral development that care ethics seeks to correct is the notion that moral decision-making is a strictly rational math problem that can be solved with enough information. You know, the way we've been handling the question this whole video. There's always more information that isn't necessarily available to you, and in particular, there's even more information that is often ignored when we try to think about the moral decision as being objective and solvable. In particular, we ignore those aspects of ourselves that are undeniable, but that are still largely dismissed as subjective. There are a ton of different ways that philosophers have broken down this particular aspect of moral decision-making, but I'll just go through a couple here in order to lay the groundwork. I think in the long run, they'll all more or less point to the same sort of judgment on Joel. The first is one that I think is particularly poignant given the situation that Joel's in, and one that's advocated for by Eva Feder-Kate. Her moral theory focuses on advocating for people who can't advocate for themselves, but she says we don't need to be able to communicate effectively in order to understand what kind of treatment these people would desire. Given that we could have just as easily been them, through a stray gene mutation or by finding ourselves in the same accident that they had, she says it shouldn't be difficult to adopt a modal or possible self where we imagine ourselves in their shoes and then reason out how we would want to be treated as a result. We would want to be treated with love and care and respect. And so the clear conclusion for Kate is that we should treat them with love and care and respect. But why do I bring all this up? Well, in the situation in the game, Ellie's already under anesthetic, and from all the information that Joel's been given up to this point, she wasn't able to advocate on her own behalf at all. And so Joel has to make a decision for her, in the moment, based on this empathetic mode of caring. When Joel adopts this modal self, imagining himself in Ellie's position, it's pretty clear why he makes the decision that he does. Even though the game has largely been about his growth from the cold and jaded smuggler we see in the early chapters, it's still pretty clear that he's at best, skeptical, and at worst downright hostile to any idea of hope. Even up until the last moments, Joel expresses doubts and hesitations that going to the Fireflies is the best option.
We don't have to do this. You know that, right?
What's the other option?
Go back to Tommy's. Just be done with this whole damn thing.
And so, when presented with the question about whether or not he would want to die for something he doesn't see as realistic, of course he would be opposed. And since Ellie can't make that choice for herself, he makes it for her, so that she doesn't have to die for nothing. But wait, I hear you say. Ellie told him in those same moments of hesitation that she wanted to go through with finding the Fireflies because, and I quote,
After all we've been through. Everything that I've done. It can't be for nothing.
And yeah, that's true, but Ellie didn't know that she would have to die, and Joel, you do what you have to do to survive Miller, would pretty reasonably project a don't die at any cost attitude on Ellie when she can't make decisions for herself. Especially because he's seen Ellie, and I quote,
It was her. She fought like hell to get here.
So, at least under this interpretation, it seems like Joel might be in the clear for advocating the best he could for someone who couldn't advocate for herself. Now, the second version of care ethics I want to talk about is one that Annette Beyer offers as a way of trying to synthesize the cold obligation of our other normative theories and the relation-based emphasis of care ethics. She says that we make a mistake when we consider parenthood to be strictly an obligation. Just one problematic result of this is that it would obligate people who think they would be bad parents to avoid being parents by any means necessary. I'll let you use your imagination to figure out what all that entails. But just one issue is that even people who think they would be bad parents could actually be good parents. We see that in The Last of Us. Joel wants nothing to do with Ellie in the beginning. But Joel does come to love Ellie. Care and love can come about in people who don't even expect it from themselves. And so there seems to be something overriding the initial obligation when one finds themselves suddenly being a parent. And whatever this is, seems to be pretty universal for all parents. Neil Druckmann himself, a month after The Last of Us released, tweeted this: I haven't met even one parent that disagreed with Joel's decision. For non-parents, it's about 50-50. So it seems like there has to be something in the fact that every parent that the writer of the game talked to, and every parent that I've discussed the game with, thinks that Joel made the right choice. I mean, surely it can't be that every single parent can be wrong about this. So what are they, and half of everyone else, latching onto? I'm not a parent. I don't know. I'm with Abby. If it were me on the table, I'd want my parents to let me die for the chance at saving the world. But just like virtue is something that's learned through experience, maybe we can only learn about certain aspects of certain relationships the same way, by experiencing them. If you're not a parent, you'll never understand exactly what's happening in a relationship with a child. It's not mathematical. It's not a reasoned obligation. And that's what care ethics tells us. No matter how many times parents have tried to explain it to me, I just don't get it. But that doesn't mean that it's not real, because given the testimony, it clearly is. There's something fundamental in the universally felt responsibilities of parenthood that prioritizes the relationships that you have with those you're charged with over the relationships that exist in the rest of the world. And if we're to take Beyer seriously, that parenthood needs to be given a more prominent place in moral recognition and praise. That means that if parents universally would save Ellie over the world, Joel deserves some praise for what he did, or at least some recognition for latching on to this fundamental aspect of parenthood. It was the hard choice, to be sure, but it was the only one he could make, given his relationship with Ellie. That means we have our first moral theory where Joel unambiguously made the right call. But how does he stack up overall? This is where you thought I was going to tell you once and for all whether or not Joel was a good or bad person or not, right? Well, joke's on you. Moral philosophy is super complicated. But let's see where we ended up anyways. So, if we're going strictly by the numbers, Joel's looking pretty morally monstrous. 1, 1, and 4 isn't a great record by any means. But that's why all of these different moral theories exist. They all disagree slightly on what sorts of actions should be allowed or condemned. So even if there's not a definitive answer to the question, given the theories all disagree, you now at least have the tools to start figuring out what you prioritize in your moral decision-making. Maybe you think that the categorical imperative is huge, but that I picked up on the wrong maxim in Joel's reasoning. Maybe you think that there are certain virtues that Joel lives up to in his decision that I neglected. Or you can work backwards, and if you think Joel was right, you can look at the theories that allow for it and figure out what they pick up on that the others don't, so that you can take that aspect of moral decision making and apply it to your own moral decisions moving forward. Regardless, I want to hear what you think in the comments down below. Is Joel a moral monster for saving Ellie? Or am I for even questioning his actions to begin with? You tell me. In the meantime, please take a minute to like and share this video, and if you want more videos about how philosophy interacts with your favorite aspects of pop culture, subscribe too. Because while all of our moral theories might disagree on Joel's particular choice, what they do all agree on is that subscribing is the only right action in this situation.